The evening sky over Maplewood was painted with fading streaks of gold and rose as the sun dipped behind the tall oak trees that lined the quiet suburban street. Margaret slipped on her light jacket, the same one she wore every evening when she went for her walk with her son Daniel. At 61, those walks had become the best part of her day, a time to breathe, talk, and feel close to her only child. After her husband, Michael, had passed away 8 years earlier, those quiet walks were what helped her find peace again. Daniel had been her anchor, and somehow, even as life grew busier for him, he always made time for her. That evening, though, something felt different. From the moment they stepped outside, Margaret could sense Daniel wasn't his usual self. He walked beside her, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, his eyes focused on the pavement instead of the trees or the sky. Normally, he would talk endlessly about work, about the people in his office, about a funny story he'd heard that day. But tonight, he was quiet, almost distant. "Long day?" she asked softly, keeping her voice light. He gave her a small smile. "Yeah, just thinking." Margaret didn't ask what about. She had learned long ago that Daniel opened up when he was ready. Still, she couldn't help worrying. He had always been thoughtful and kind, but lately he seemed heavier, like something had been sitting on his chest for weeks. They continued walking, their footsteps echoing softly along the empty sidewalk. They passed the park where Daniel used to play as a boy. Margaret's eyes softened as memories came flooding back. Little Daniel running after a red ball, laughing with his father, his cheeks flushed in the sun. It felt like a lifetime ago. She smiled faintly. "You used to love that park. You'd make me stay until it got dark." He glanced at the park, his expression distant. "Yeah, I remember." Margaret noticed how his voice carried a trace of sadness. "You okay, Danny?" she asked gently. He nodded, but his silence spoke louder than words. She didn't press, though her heart tightened with concern. Daniel wasn't one to hide things, but when something really troubled him, he withdrew, just like his father used to. They turned onto Maple Avenue, where the streetlights began flickering on. The light bathed the road in a soft amber glow, and the air grew cooler. Margaret wrapped her scarf a little tighter around her neck. The neighborhood was quiet, the hum of crickets, the soft rustle of leaves, the faint sound of a television playing from a nearby house. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course, honey. You can ask me anything." He hesitated, then sighed. "It's not really a question, more like something I should tell you." Margaret slowed her pace, sensing that whatever was coming wasn't easy for him. She turned to look at him, her expression calm but encouraging. "Then tell me." He looked away, his jaw tightening slightly. "It's about someone I care about." Margaret's lips curved into a small smile. "Oh," she said warmly. "So this is about a girl, then?" He gave a nervous chuckle, but didn't answer right away. "Something like that," he murmured. There was a long pause before he continued. "I didn't plan for it to happen, Mom. It just did. And now I don't know what to do." Her curiosity grew, but she could see how tense he was. She decided not to make it harder. "You don't have to rush," she said softly. "Take your time. Whatever it is, I'll understand." He met her eyes for a brief second. There was emotion there, something raw and uncertain. Margaret felt a pang in her chest. She remembered that same look when he was younger, when he'd done something wrong but didn't want to disappoint her. Only this time, it wasn't guilt, it was fear of being understood. They stopped near a bench by the river that ran through their neighborhood. It was one of Margaret's favorite spots, a place where she often sat to watch the water shimmer under the evening light. Daniel took a deep breath and sat down, running his hands over his knees like he was gathering courage. "Mom," he began, "I've been keeping this to myself for a while. I didn't want to tell you because I didn't know how you'd react." She sat beside him, calm but attentive. "You're my son," she said softly. "There's nothing you could say that would make me love you less." He looked at her then, and something in his expression changed. Relief, maybe mixed with gratitude. "It's not bad," he said quietly. "It's just unexpected." Margaret nodded slowly. "Love usually is." He gave a faint smile. "Yeah, but it's different this time. I care about someone, but I can't tell anyone else yet. It's complicated." Margaret reached out and placed her hand over his. "Complicated doesn't mean wrong, Daniel. Sometimes the heart just knows before the mind catches up." For a moment, he didn't speak. The river shimmered with the last hints of daylight. The world felt still, as if waiting for his next words. Finally, he said, "I think I'm falling in love, Mom, but it's with someone who doesn't fit what people expect." Margaret's eyes softened. She didn't ask who it was or why it was complicated. She just held his hand a little tighter. "Love doesn't always make sense," she said quietly, "but it's real, and that's what matters." Daniel exhaled, almost as if he'd been holding his breath for days. "You're not upset." "Why would I be?" she asked with a small smile. "You found someone who makes you feel alive. That's something to be grateful for." He looked at her with quiet amazement. "You always know what to say." She chuckled softly. "That's because I've been around longer than you. I've seen how love changes people. Sometimes it breaks them, sometimes it saves them. But it's always worth feeling." The two sat in silence for a while, the evening wrapping around them like a blanket. The breeze carried the scent of the river, the sound of gentle ripples filling the air. Daniel seemed lighter, though he still hadn't told her everything. Margaret could tell there was more to his story, something he wasn't ready to say just yet, as they stood to head home. Daniel's voice broke the silence again. "Mom, thank you for listening." She smiled and looped her arm through his as they walked back toward the streetlights. "Always, sweetheart. That's what mothers do." But inside, Margaret's mind was spinning. Who was this person Daniel cared about? What made it so complicated? And why did she sense that this confession was just the beginning of something far deeper than she realized? The night grew colder, but her heart felt strangely warm. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing. That moment, that walk, had changed something between them. A wall had come down. What Daniel had said was only the start of the truth. And soon, she would discover the rest, a revelation that would leave her more moved than she could ever imagine. The next morning, Margaret woke up earlier than usual. She sat by the kitchen window with her cup of tea, watching the pale sunlight stretch across the yard. But her thoughts weren't on the quiet beauty of the morning, they were on Daniel. His words from the night before kept replaying in her mind. "I think I'm falling in love, but it's complicated." Those words had been soft, uncertain, yet heavy with meaning. She didn't want to pry, but a mother's heart always searches for what lies between the lines. Who was this person Daniel had spoken about? Why did he seem afraid to tell her more? Margaret tried to shake the thoughts away and focus on her day. Still, she couldn't ignore the small ache of curiosity that tugged at her chest by the time Daniel came downstairs. Dressed for work, she had prepared breakfast, scrambled eggs. Toast and coffee, the same as always. He looked tired but lighter somehow, as if finally sharing a piece of his secret had given him relief. "Morning, Mom," he said, forcing a smile. "Morning, sweetheart. You didn't sleep well?" He chuckled softly. "You could tell, huh?" She nodded, sipping her tea. "You've had that look since you were a boy. Something on your mind?" Daniel paused, leaning against the counter. "Yeah, but I'll tell you soon. I just need to figure it out first." Margaret didn't push. Instead, she reached out and touched his arm. "No rush. Just remember, you don't have to carry everything alone." He smiled at that, a real one this time, and kissed her cheek before leaving for work. Margaret watched him go, her heart filled with both pride and worry. The day passed slowly. She spent most of it tidying the house, reading a book, and doing small chores to distract herself. But her thoughts drifted again and again to her son. She thought of his kindness, his patience, and how much he had changed over the years. After his father's death, Daniel had stepped up in every way, fixing things around the house, checking on her after work, even cooking dinner when she was too tired. He had been her strength when she had none. And now, the idea of him struggling with something he couldn't share, hurt her more than she wanted to admit. That evening, the phone rang just as she was folding laundry. It was Daniel. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice calm but thoughtful. "You free tonight?" Margaret smiled. "Always." "What's up?" "I thought maybe we could go for another walk. I want to talk some more." She agreed instantly. When Daniel wanted to talk, she never said no. By the time he arrived, the sun was already dipping low. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. They walked along the same path as before, their steps matching in rhythm. For a while, they just listened to the soft hum of the evening. Daniel finally spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what I told you yesterday. I have to," she admitted with a small smile. "You sounded conflicted." He nodded. "Yeah, it's not easy, Mom. I've met someone, and she's special. But it's not a simple situation." Margaret kept her tone light. "Is she married?" He laughed quietly. "No, nothing like that." Then his expression softened. "She's older than me." Margaret blinked in surprise. "Older?" He nodded. "Much older." "How much older?" she asked gently. Daniel hesitated. "Around 20 years?" Margaret stopped walking for a moment. It wasn't what she'd expected, but she didn't react with shock or disapproval. Instead, she took a slow breath and said, "Age isn't everything, Daniel. What matters is how someone makes you feel." He looked at her, relief flickering in his eyes. "That's what I keep telling myself. She's amazing mom, kind, strong, smart. She's been through a lot, but she still carries herself with so much grace. I didn't plan for this, but when I'm around her, it feels right." Margaret's heart softened. His voice was filled with sincerity, not confusion or rebellion. This wasn't some wild fling, it was real emotion. "Does she know how you feel?" she asked quietly. Daniel nodded. "Yes, but she's hesitant. She worries about what people will think, especially her family. She's afraid she hurt me or that I'll regret it someday." Margaret walked beside him again, her expression thoughtful. "It sounds like she cares about you deeply." "She does," he said softly. "But she's scared." Margaret smiled faintly. "That fear comes from love, Daniel, not from doubt." They walked in silence for a while, the streetlights flickering on one by one. Daniel's words replayed in her mind, older, kind, strong. Margaret realized this woman must have had a profound impact on him. There was something tender in the way he spoke, something genuine and raw. Finally, she asked, "Do you love her?" He stopped walking again, his eyes on the ground. "I think I do, Mom. I never thought I'd say that about anyone. But she's different. I feel like I've known her my whole life." Margaret's heart filled with emotion. It wasn't easy hearing that every mother wants to be the main figure in her son's heart, but she also knew this was a good thing. Love meant growth, courage, connection. She smiled softly and said, "Then you owe it to yourself to be honest with her. Love doesn't wait forever." Daniel nodded, his expression pensive. "I know, but she said she doesn't think she deserves me." Margaret stopped and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Then remind her that love isn't about deserving. It's about finding someone who sees your heart and chooses to stay." He looked at her with admiration. "You always make things sound so simple." She smiled faintly. "That's because the truth usually is. We're the ones who make it complicated." They reached the bridge that crossed the small river. The water reflected the moonlight, rippling softly beneath them. Daniel leaned on the railing, his face lost in thought. "Do you think people can find love at the wrong time?" he asked. Margaret thought for a moment before answering. "No, I think love shows up when we need it most. Even if it confuses us, even if it scares us, it's never wrong to feel something deeply." Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with warmth. "I knew you'd understand," she smiled. "That's my job." The rest of the walk was quiet, but it was a peaceful silence. Margaret could feel that Daniel's heart had lightened, not because all his problems were solved, but because he knew she accepted him. That kind of acceptance meant everything. Later that night, after Daniel had gone home, Margaret sat in her living room, lost in thought. She couldn't help but wonder about the woman her son cared for. What kind of person had made him open up like this? She felt a mix of curiosity and admiration, and a small pang of nostalgia, because once, long ago, she too had felt that kind of love, unexpected, overwhelming, and completely beyond logic. As the clock ticked softly and the night grew still, Margaret smiled to herself. Her son had inherited her heart, brave, loyal, and capable of deep love. She didn't know how his story would unfold. But one thing was certain: she would stand by him no matter what. And deep down, she sensed that this story, his story, was only just beginning. A week passed after that quiet evening walk. Margaret kept herself busy with her usual routines: gardening, reading, visiting neighbors. But Daniel's confessions still lingered in her thoughts. Every time her phone buzzed, she half expected a message from him saying he'd made a decision about the woman he loved. But no such message came. She didn't want to push, yet she knew her son was wrestling with something deeper than he'd admitted. On Saturday morning, she was pruning her roses when she heard a car pull into the driveway. Daniel stepped out, holding a bouquet of daisies and wearing a nervous smile. Margaret noticed it immediately, the kind of anxious energy that came before big news. "Morning, Mom," he said, handing her the flowers. "Well, this is a surprise," she replied with a soft laugh. "What did I do to deserve these?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "I have something to tell you. Or rather, someone to introduce." Margaret's eyebrows lifted. Someone. Before she could say more, a car door closed and a woman stepped out. She was elegant but modest, wearing a light gray coat, her silver blonde hair tucked neatly behind her ears. She looked to be in her late 40s, maybe early 50s, though her posture carried the confidence of someone younger. Her eyes, gentle yet cautious, met Margaret's. "Mom," Daniel began, his voice steady but soft. "This is Claire." Margaret blinked, her heart skipping for a moment. So this was her, the woman who had captured Daniel's heart. Claire stepped forward with a polite smile. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Mrs. Walker." Margaret smiled kindly. "Please call me Margaret." She extended her hand and Claire took it, her touch warm but hesitant. They went inside, and Margaret made coffee for the three of them. The air felt thick with unspoken thoughts. Margaret studied Claire carefully, not in judgment, but in quiet curiosity. There was a kindness in her eyes, something genuine. Still, she noticed the faint nervousness in the woman's posture, as if she wasn't sure she belonged. So Margaret began setting the cups on the table. "You two met at work?" Daniel nodded quickly. "Yeah, Claire's the project coordinator for one of our clients. We started working together a few months ago." Margaret smiled. "And then?" Claire chuckled softly, her voice low and soothing. "Then we started talking about everything except work. Books, music, travel. He made me laugh during a very stressful time." Daniel looked at her with quiet affection. "She did the same for me." Margaret felt her chest tighten, not in disapproval, but in something else. She could see the connection between them, the way their glances met in small, unspoken ways. It wasn't forced or shallow. It was real. For a few moments, the conversation flowed easily. They talked about food, movies, and family. Claire mentioned growing up in Oregon, her love for coastal drives, and how she had recently started painting again. Margaret found herself genuinely enjoying the woman's company. But there was also an undercurrent of tension, something unspoken that both Margaret and Claire felt. Eventually, Claire set her cup down and took a small breath. "I know this must seem unexpected," she said gently, meeting Margaret's eyes. "Daniel and I didn't plan for this. It just happened." Margaret appreciated her honesty. "Love usually does," she replied softly. Claire's eyes flickered with gratitude. "Still, I worry what people might say. I'm not blind to how it looks, me being older, having lived more life than he has." Daniel quickly interjected, "It doesn't matter what anyone thinks." Margaret held up a hand, her tone calm. "Let her speak, Daniel." She turned back to Claire. You're right, it's not easy when the world expects love to fit a certain mold. But hearts don't check calendars. That made Claire smile faintly. I just don't want to hold him back. He's young, full of possibilities. I've already lived through so many chapters. I don't want him to miss his own because of me. Daniel reached for her hand, and Margaret noticed the tenderness in that small gesture. It wasn't reckless or naive. It was deliberate, respectful. Mom, he said, turning to her, I've thought about this a lot. She makes me happy, and I'm not confused or trying to replace anything. I just know what I feel. Margaret looked at her son, her heart swelling with emotion. For a moment she saw him not as the little boy who used to run around the yard, but as a man strong, loving, capable of making his own choices. I can see that, she said finally. And Claire. The older woman looked up, her expression uncertain. You seem like a good woman. You speak with honesty, and that's more than I can say for many people. My son's happiness means everything to me. If you care for him sincerely, that's all I need to know. Claire's eyes softened. I do, Margaret. More than I expected. A brief silence filled the room. It wasn't uncomfortable anymore, just heavy with emotion. Margaret smiled gently. Then that's enough for me. Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Thank you, Mom. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Just promise me one thing, take care of each other. Love is fragile at any age. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking more comfortably. Claire opened up about her life, how she had been divorced for several years, how she'd focused so much on her career that she had forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen. Daniel listened with patience, his eyes full of respect, by the time they said goodbye. Margaret felt something unexpected, a quiet peace. As she hugged Claire, she whispered, You have a kind soul. Don't let fear ruin something beautiful. Claire smiled, touched. Thank you, Margaret. That means more than you know. After they left, the house felt still again, but not empty. Margaret stood by the window, watching Daniel's car disappear down the road. She realized she wasn't losing her son, she was simply watching him build his own story. That night, she sat with a cup of tea, reflecting on everything. Life had a strange way of repeating itself. She remembered how her own mother had once looked at her and her late husband different backgrounds, uncertain beginnings, and had told her the same thing she had told Daniel. Love doesn't always make sense, but it's always worth the risk. Margaret smiled at the memory. Maybe this was the cycle of love, passing down not just lessons, but the courage to follow one's heart. She wasn't worried anymore. She trusted Daniel. And she believed in the quiet strength she saw in Claire's eyes. Somewhere in the stillness of that evening, she whispered to herself, he's going to be just fine. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt content. A few months had passed since that heartfelt afternoon when Daniel had introduced Claire to his mother. The days flowed smoothly, marked by small changes that carried deep meaning. Margaret noticed how her son seemed lighter. Now his laughter came easier. His eyes held a calm she hadn't seen in years. It filled her with quiet pride to see him happy. She didn't talk about his relationship much, but whenever he mentioned Claire, she could hear the tenderness in his voice. One early spring evening, the sun hung low, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Margaret was sitting on the porch, sipping her tea and watching the light fade behind the hills. The air smelled of rain and lilacs. She had always loved this time of year, the gentle promise of renewal. As she rocked slowly in her chair, she heard a familiar sound. Daniel's car pulling into the driveway. He hadn't said he was coming by, but that wasn't unusual. He often stopped after work just to check in. She smiled, setting down her cup as he walked up the steps. Hey, he said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. Hey yourself, she replied, smiling. What brings you here this late? He hesitated for a second, then sat beside her. Just wanted to talk. Been thinking about a few things? Margaret looked at him carefully. There was a certain seriousness in his eyes, a calm but weighty look she'd seen only when he had something important to say. She waited, After a long pause, he said quietly, "Mom, Claire and we've decided to get married." Margaret froze for just a heartbeat. Then warmth filled her chest. "Married," she repeated softly. He nodded, watching her face carefully. "We didn't want to rush into anything, but it just feels right. She makes me better, Mom. I can't imagine life without her." Margaret's lips curved into a soft, emotional smile. "Daniel, that's wonderful news." He looked relieved, almost as if he'd feared she might react differently. "You really think so?" "Of course," she said, placing a hand over his. "When you told me about her, I could see it already. You weren't unsure you were in love. And seeing you both together that day confirmed everything I needed to know." Daniel exhaled, tension easing from his shoulders. "We want something simple, nothing big or fancy. Just a small ceremony, maybe in her backyard. And we'd love for you to be part of it. Claire really wants that." Margaret's eyes softened. "I'd be honored." They sat quietly for a while, listening to the sound of crickets and the wind rustling through the trees. The world seemed peaceful, but inside Margaret's heart was stirring. She wasn't sad, far from it, but there was that ache every parent feels when their child takes another step away from home, another step into a new life. A few weeks later, the wedding took place in Claire's garden, a small, beautiful space surrounded by blooming hydrangeas and soft fairy lights strung through the trees. The air was filled with laughter, music, and the scent of fresh flowers. Margaret stood near the front, her eyes misty as she watched her son waiting at the altar. Then Claire appeared, walking slowly down the path. She looked radiant, not because of her dress, but because of the peace in her eyes. When she reached Daniel, he took her hands with such tenderness that even Margaret's heart fluttered. The ceremony was short, heartfelt, and full of quiet emotion. There were no grand speeches, no dramatics, just real words spoken from the heart. When Daniel said his vows, his voice trembled, but his gaze never left Claire's. "I used to think love was something you planned for," he said softly. "But then you came along, and I realized it's something you recognize when your heart finally feels safe." Claire smiled, her own eyes shimmering. "And I used to think my story had already been written," she replied. "But you showed me it was just beginning." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden when they exchanged rings. Margaret wiped her tears, smiling through them. For the first time in a long while, she felt the deep comfort of knowing her son was where he belonged. After the ceremony, the guests gathered around the small tables, sharing stories and laughter under the stars. Margaret watched Daniel and Claire move through the crowd, holding hands, greeting friends, stealing small glances at each other. Their connection was so natural, so effortless, it filled her with joy. Later that night, as the music faded and the guests began to leave, Daniel found his mother sitting quietly on the patio. The lantern light flickered over her face. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" he said, sitting beside her. "It is," she said softly, "and a beautiful day, too." He looked at her for a long moment before taking her hand gently. "Mom, I know this must feel strange, seeing me move on, start something new. But I want you to know you'll always be my home." Margaret's eyes welled up again, but she smiled. "You don't lose your home when you build another one, Daniel. You just make more room for love." They sat there for a while, not saying much, just listening to the sound of the night. Margaret thought back to when Daniel was little, how he'd cling to her hand when he was scared, how she used to promise him everything would be all right. And now, sitting there with his hand in hers, she realized it was all right. When he and Claire finally drove off, Margaret stayed on the patio, looking at the stars. Her heart felt full, and for once, completely at peace. She thought about how life had surprised her, how love had found her son when neither of them had expected it. The next morning, she woke early, sunlight streaming through the curtains. The world outside looked new, clean, and full of possibility. She walked into the garden and saw a single white daisy growing among her rosettes, the same flowers Daniel had once brought her. She smiled, touched its petals, and whispered, "He's happy." And for a woman who had lived through loss, change, and time, That simple truth was everything. Love didn't have an age. It didn't follow a plan. It just bloomed quietly wherever it was meant to. And as long as her son carried that love with him, Margaret knew her heart would never feel lonely again. That night, she wrote in her journal a habit she'd kept since she was a young woman. Her last line read, "When we let love grow without judgment, it finds its way to peace. My son found his, and in doing so, he helped me find mine." Margaret closed the book, smiled to herself, and blew out the candle beside her. The room fell into a soft glow, and outside, the stars shimmered like tiny blessings. She whispered a quiet thank you to life, to love, and to the small miracles that kept the heart young. And with that, she went to bed, her soul at rest.